Hello, and welcome to tonight's program, Asian American Involvement in U.S. Politics, featuring Congressman Andy Kim, a Democrat who represents the 3rd District of New Jersey. My name is Tom Byrne. I'm the president and CEO of the Korea Society in New York City. This evening's timely conversation will explore the evolving role of Asian Americans on the national political scene, among whom are now 4 Korean American members of Congress, and the most pressing issues for Asian Americans. To our audience, thank you for joining us. We have already received many questions, and we look forward to getting more. Please send those throughout the program to policy@koreasociety.org. We will convey as many questions as possible after the moderated discussion. Please check out our website at koreasociety.org for other programming that might be of interest to you. This Thursday at noon, we have a session that asks the question, what makes a great Korea analyst? It features Scott Snyder, Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, Marcus Garlauskas, a former U.S. National Intelligence Officer for North Korea, and now a Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council, and Rachel Min-Young Lee, a non-resident fellow at the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C. For this evening's program, we are fortunate and excited to have a great speaker as well as a great moderator. It's my pleasure to introduce Tony Kim, who will then introduce Representative Andy Kim. Some words about Tony. He is a board director of the Korea Society and is a partner at Centerview Partners. His specialty is on strategic advice and mergers and acquisitions. One of his deals includes CVS's acquisition of Aetna, among the more than $500 billion in M&A deals he has executed in his 20+ years in the financial services industry. Tony earned a BS and BA from the Wharton School and the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Pennsylvania. Tony, thanks so much for joining us. Over to you.
Great, thanks, Tom. Thanks for that introduction. So I'm going to introduce Andy Kim. Andy is a friend, and I've been a longtime supporter of Andy. As Tom mentioned, he represents New Jersey's 3rd Congressional District. He's dedicated his entire career to public service. So starting as a Rhodes Scholar, he spent time in the White House, the Pentagon, State Department, and in Afghanistan as a strategic advisor to the commanding general. He was first elected in 2018 when he unseated a Republican incumbent, and it made him the first Korean American Democrat ever elected to the House of Representatives, and the first Asian American from New Jersey elected to federal office. In 2020, he won re-election by 8 points, despite President Trump also winning the district. He is now one of only 7 Democrats in Congress and the only person of color representing a district that Trump won. Andy's district is less than 4% Asian and is 76% white, so his success has been from having broad-based appeal on issues that matter to the district. At the same time, Andy has more recently risen to have a more national profile as an elected official who has spoken out vocally on Asian issues, including stopping hate crimes against Asian Americans. So Andy, thanks very much for joining us. I'm going to give a little bit of setup for the audience in terms of some background facts, and then open it up to remarks from you before we get to Q&A. So here are some background facts. Asians are the fastest growing racial group in America, 20+ million people, a 30% increase over the last 10 years. So that's 6% of the US population, but higher in various metro areas. For example, here in New York City, it's 16% of the population. And increasingly, they are quite active as voters. We are the fastest growing electorate in swing states like Georgia, Florida, Texas, Nevada, and North Carolina. Turnout in the 2020 presidential election was 59%, up from 49% in 2016, and was the biggest proportional increase of any minority group. There are 18 representatives of Asian descent in Congress, 16 in the House and 2 in the Senate. At the same time, Asians are the most underrepresented minority group in elected office, representing less than 1% of all elected officials. And of course, there is the very real question of, are Asians a group or a collection of very distinct subgroups with diverse cultures and opinions? And we'll get into that just here in a minute. But first, to start, Andy, I'm sure the audience would love to hear about your background and what made you decide to run for office.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Tony, for the introduction. Thank you to the Korea Society for hosting this really important conversation and discussion, and one that I honestly think about all the time in terms of what is leading up to this moment, but also what will be proceeding forward and what we will see in terms of engagement from the API community in our politics. Just real briefly, for me, I'm the son of immigrants, married to an immigrant, someone who never thought about politics when I was younger, really, in any significant way. And honestly, even still to this moment, I don't necessarily consider myself to be a political person per se. I've come at this work from an angle of service. That was how my parents kind of connected me in with government work. Being in politics or even being in government wasn't something that my parents ever encouraged me to do. It was not something that I really grew up in a community that talked about doing that. I did not grow up knowing anyone who worked in the government. So it was really for me later in my life where I felt very passionate about foreign policy as someone who was in college during September 11th. That was a galvanizing experience for me to say what is it that I can do to serve this country. But even as I got engaged as a diplomat and worked in government, I was a nonpartisan career official. I was not a political appointee, did not, I was in national security. So I very much felt like I had to serve, no matter which party was in power. And so I didn't get too engaged in the politics. And so, I'm still learning and I'm still understanding what that kind of engagement means. And, I think about it a lot, and I'll just end on just this one quick story and we can open up for a conversation. But I often think through when I think about Asian Americans and politics, I often think back to this story as I was just a couple days out from, it was like 2 days before the 2018 elections. I went to this Korean American church in my outside of my district, where I don't have a very large Asian American population in my district. It's only 3% Asian American in my congressional district, but there is a Korean American church there. And I went to visit it, and I talked with this older Korean American woman. And she was so excited. She's like, "Oh, I live in your district. I'm so excited. You might be able to win, and I can call you my congressman." And she's like, "I just can't believe this is happening, that you're on TV and you might win this thing." And I told her, "Well, okay, well, make sure you get out there and vote." And she said, "Oh, I'm not registered." And it wasn't like apologetic or anything like that. She wasn't saying like, "Oh, like, I'm sorry, I'm not ready." She didn't. She just said, "I'm not political," is what she said. And I think about that experience a lot, because I wish I think through what is it that I should have told her? What is it that I could have had a conversation with her about? And I look back and I think what I understood is that she saw politics as this kind of tribal clash, as something more akin to kind of a sporting event, and seeing and describing which party is in power. And I wish I had an ability to connect in with her and explain how, that the Medicare healthcare that she's on, that's politics, that's governance, that the immigration policies that allow Korean Americans and Asian Americans to come to this country and to get an education here, that's politics. I think about the scholarship that my dad was able to get to come to this country and study and then become a PhD in genetics. That's about our governance and our politics. So what I just say is I think what's important is to explain and help people understand how government and politics affects their life and how it can help them live their best life. So that's just sort of some opening thoughts that I had as we roll into this. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Tony.
Right. Thanks, Andy. So I'm going to open it up with a great question that we got from the audience to kick it off. It's very much sort of top of mind as I was thinking about this topic. How should one think about the term Asian American? With the Asian American population growing and becoming more diverse, does it really work as a definition for political needs, or would it be better to think in terms of smaller groups?
Yeah, it's important to understand that the API community is not monolithic by any means, and we see that diversity across the board, whether that's the different languages or the cultures or also just the fact that, you know, the AAPI community, it's very geographically dispersed right now. And honestly, as I've engaged and got to know different parts of this community around the country, they're not as well connected in with each other. You know, they are very isolated in some ways, and there is not really a national infrastructure to really connect the dots at this point. So you know, so what I'll say is right now, certainly not monolithic. That being said, I do still find value in talking about the AAPI community and the Asian American community writ large, especially during COVID. I think there were a lot of shared challenges and experiences that I think were helpful in terms of understanding and looking out for each other and finding ways to be able to build that up. You know, I was on the select committee on the coronavirus crisis, and I just saw how, over and over again, how Asian American communities were often left out of considerations when it comes for small business support or about information or language access when it comes to the vaccines or the testing. So I do feel like there is still value there, but we have to come into it with a lot of humility that it is not an identity that is first and foremost on everyone's minds. And that it lacks the kind of gravity, you know, kind of pulling in gravity force that I think some other types of identity markers are. But I do think that's in part because you know, as I said, there is no national infrastructure and connection on that, but I think that's starting to change. And I certainly feel like over the last couple months, I've seen a big change in how the API community is engaged nationally, as we've seen this increased violence and discrimination facing the community. I'm starting to see the first glimmers of that national infrastructure, and I think it's really setting up to be a very powerful force.
So let's just follow up on that point. You know, violence against Asians has been a big topic over the past 20 months during the pandemic. Do you think that really has become a big driver for voter turnout, for engagement in the political process?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think we've yet to see whether or not there's sustainability to that kind of energy. So, you know, we saw a lot of that bubbling up at the beginning of this year. And I was glad to see that there was a lot of attention, and I was glad to see that there was a lot of energy. And it was so tough that it took such a tragedy of the shootings in Atlanta and the broader violence that we're seeing, especially that targeted towards our elders. It was tough that it took that to really get that on the radars of others. But I'm glad it did. But the challenge, though, is how do you sustain that kind of attention? And how do you convert that attention into action? And I think that those are where the question marks land right now. Yes, there was some continued follow through and attention through Asian American Heritage Month in May. But I feel like I've seen a pretty steep drop off, in terms of the broader engagement. And some of that is natural, and we understand that. But, I think there's a question of what's going to sustain. And that's why I keep talking about this as infrastructure, just, community infrastructure, because that kind of engagement and that network is important for the sustainment of this attention. And I think that that's really what I'm trying to engage on now and trying to help support. And if we get that right, I do think that there's going to be an increased level of political engagement, not just in the aftermath of a crisis or a tragedy, but something that'll be more durable. And honestly, that'll be more powerful as well.
Great, thanks, Andy. On that same topic of sort of what's driving engagement of Asians in the political process, I read this article where the author was, sort of saying they felt they had done everything according to the rules. They'd done everything to fit in and succeed, and they were frustrated for sort of how the system wasn't working out for them. Interestingly, that's sort of a very common narrative in America today across lots of different audiences. But, there's this element of like, I can't rely on the system to sort of treat me fairly anymore. And do you think that is a factor? And that does feel like something that has maybe longer sustainability for for voter engagement here.
Yeah, I do think that I mean, look, that same kind of thinking is why I ended up running for Congress, is that, I'm somebody that worked in government before. I believe in our democratic institutions, but I always saw, these institutions that I believe in making decisions that I did not agree with. And ultimately, what I came to think about is a line that my boss at the State Department when I was a diplomat, my first boss, he had this line that he taught me. He said, "You don't have good government unless you have good people working in government." And I think what I took from that is that it's so often easy to think about our government as a system. You use the words that you said, that we are in this system as a country and that it's moving forward. But I think we realize is that government is not just a machine of cogs and wheels. It is people make up our government, and the government we have is reflective of the kind of people that we have working in it. And I really took that to heart and decided that was a reason why I needed to have a voice in the room and a seat at the table. And I hope that if people are frustrated about the system, I hope they use that as a call towards engagement, because I truly believe that the opposite of democracy and the greatest threat to our democracy is apathy, is if people feel like there is a flaw in the system and that it's not working for them, so they instead say, why bother? And I really think, I think about this line a lot, that I think it was Coretta Scott King, which is, in these times of trouble, roll up your hands, don't throw up your roll up your sleeves, don't throw up your hands. And I think that's, I hope people, if they experience that frustration, they channel it into engagement and how to change the government and recognize that it's important to have that voice in the room and that seat at the table. So I very much sympathize and honestly connect with that kind of sentiment, though.
Thank you. That's a great response, and one that I've heard you sort of say to me before, and it's one of the reasons why I've decided to do things like this, which is kind of getting people more engaged, getting them more involved, and sort of not just sitting from the sidelines and letting things happen. Interestingly, in that vein, you have created a PAC, right, which is dedicated to identifying and supporting Asians and other people of color in running for office. So I imagine that's linked to this topic. What prompted you to do that, and where are you most focused with this initiative?
Yeah, so I started this PAC called In Our Hands, as you mentioned. That's honestly trying to do something that I wish I had the ability to connect in with when I was starting out. So when I first started running for office, I had never run for office before. I was not a wealthy person, not a connected person. And I was running in a district that's 85% white, that has less than 3% Asian American population that voted for Trump in 2016. So, I had a lot of folks just tell me, like, look, like you seem like, you seem like a nice guy and all, but there's no way you can win this district. There's no way that you can win this district because you've never run before. You don't have the connections. You don't have the money. And honestly, they told me there's no way that Asian American can win this district that's 85% white with less than 3% Asian American population. And at that time, there were, 0 Korean Americans in Congress. So people were telling me, like, look, there's, if Korean Americans can't win in this area, in some of the densest populated areas of Korean Americans, they're you're as heck not going to win down in your area. So it was tough, I'll be honest. And part of me, was dissuaded by what they were saying. Part of me was like saying, maybe this is just, tilting at windmills and is impossible. But what I ended up saying is that I'm not going to allow someone else to determine what I am or am not capable of accomplishing and understanding as possible in my life. And it's that word possible that I think I've really kind of honed in on, is just this idea of can I, as a, at that time, a 34-year-old Korean American, is it possible for me to become a member of Congress? And if so, is it worth the risk there? And I ultimately decided that it was. And when I think about it in hindsight, it was that idea of possibility that allowed me to continue despite other people telling me it was impossible. So with this path, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to give people tools to understand what's possible. I've been trying to engage and connect with talented Asian Americans across this country, people who might not even be thinking about running for office, people who are leaders in business or medicine or to their community or in law, and saying, hey, people have flagged you as a really strong leader. Have you ever thought about politics? And as I've had these conversations, most of the people I talk to have never thought about politics before. But what I find interesting is none of them have said that they're completely uninterested. Some tell me maybe not now, maybe a couple years down the road. But what I like is that it's changing what they think is possible. All of a sudden, pretty much all of them said they never thought about it before. And that's what I like, is if they choose to not run down the road, that's fine, but it's their choice. That's different than them not thinking it's possible. And so the idea is that we have these engagements, we try to identify candidates, and we try to, if they want to proceed down this path, we start connecting them, building out networks, creating some infrastructure. We provide candidate training and other types of things to prepare for them to potentially run down the road and create a bench and to try to create that kind of pipeline. So I'm excited. I really think that this is the kind of effort that's going to change what people think is possible.
Thanks. When you were kind of giving your background, you talked about, you never thought you'd run for office. And your parents never sort of said, hey, do you want to be a politician? I mean, that's similar to my experience, I think, to many Asians, right? There aren't many Asians who grew up with their parents saying, hey, someday you'll be president of the United States, which is a common thing that people talk about in politics. I think there's also this cultural element, right? Where a lot of parents are like, don't draw attention to yourself, right? And running for office is kind of the opposite of don't draw attention to yourself. So, how big of a factor is that sort of cultural aspect in this underrepresentation in elected office?
I do think it plays a big role. And you're right. I think a lot, I did not grow up in a family that talked a lot about politics at the dining table. It was not really something that came up. I was not really taught to really identify with one party or the other. And honestly, kind of to your point, in some ways I was kind of told, not to make waves. And, I was kind of taught in some ways to be kind of conflict avoidance. And so that is different than kind of work that I do now. But I think what I've come to see is this idea again that, you can't assume that someone else will fight your fights for you. You can't just assume that the right thing or what you think is the right thing is going to come about and happen in this country. And, I think that that's important. Like even, I remember there was a Democratic congressman on the floor of the House of Representatives earlier this year. And he came up to me and, he just came up to me. He's like, hey, Andy, like crazy what's happening to the Asian American community around this country with the violence and the discrimination. And I was thinking, wow, I'm grateful for that. But then he went on and said, kind of patted me on the back. He's like, but don't worry, the pandemic's almost over and everything will be okay soon. And I just realized, I'm like, wow, like I feel like, like this person doesn't fully understand the challenges that are there. And this is a colleague of mine. This is a Democrat member as well, who I feel like I want to make sure that is engaged in understanding of this. So I don't blame that person for that perspective, but it shows that I cannot assume that others understand what the community is going through. And look, I also have the first to admit that I'm not saying that I'm somebody that knows all the ins and outs of what the community is struggling with all over this country. I try to come into my work with a lot of humility, the kind of humility my parents taught me, but also recognizing that we cannot make these assumptions about what others are going to do. And this idea that if you're not in the room and have a seat at the table, then you're not necessarily putting your finger on on the kind of levers of change that you want. So I think that it's that kind of understanding that I've been able to channel that has helped me understand why I think it's important that we have the engagement that we do, and why we should try to push ourselves to be, doing some things that, even if it's not necessarily the kind of actions that we were raised to think about or to engage on.
Another question from the audience around sort of this question of being an Asian American politician and finding support across diverse ethnic groups within Asians. They call out, the Boston mayoral race with Michelle Wu, and sort of, what does it take to win an election like that? I guess I might redirect slightly, which is, I think what your answer is going to be is that in order to win an election, you need to have broad-based appeal across all demographics, of course, including Asians. But I think the specific question here is, do you think that essentially that voters are identifying as, across Asian ethnic boundaries in supporting and coming out to vote for elected officials?
Yeah, I mean, look, what I will say is that I am proud that this 85% white district with less than 3% Asian American population that voted for Trump twice has now twice elected the first Korean American Democrat in the history of our country. And I feel like that is something that gives me hope about what we understand as our identities in this country, and who we think can be a voice for us in government. And, I think the way I sort of describe it is that, again, I think about people who gave me advice early on in 2017, 2018 in my first race. And I had a lot of folks tell me, like, don't talk about being Korean American, Asian American, don't talk about being a son of immigrants. But again, like, I felt like what that advice was missing is that I have to let people know who I am and why I make the decisions that I do, and why I'm doing what I'm doing. Like, a lot of people, when you're running for office, the number one question that they want to hear is, why are you doing this and who are you fighting for? Like, and people are so suspicious of politicians. They go into meeting politicians with this deep reservation of just like, what is it, suspicion about this person's motives. And I get it. Again, like, I was very much suspicious as well. And so you have to show people who you are. And what I think I come to understand is, when I told the story of my parents moving and taking the risk to come to the United States, when I talk about how my parents raised me here because they felt like here in America, they could guarantee that I could have a better life than they do. And now I'm raising my kids, a few 2 miles from where I grew up. And I'm now confronting these same issues as a parent. When I talk about that, what I recognize is that the way you can engage and the way you can talk about your story is that you can talk about my story not just as a Korean American story or an Asian American story, but it's fundamentally an American story. And that kind of connection, I think, is so important. And I really encourage Asian American communities around the country to not just think about how it is that we can talk to each other and organize with each other, but figure out then, how do you take our story and the conversations we have and put it into that broader tapestry and create that kind of broader narrative that's transformative, this narrative that talks about being Asian American as being American. And I think that that's what we're on the cusp of. And that's why I'm excited when I see candidates like Michelle Wu or others around the country that are stepping up. The fact that they're stepping up at large is great, but the fact that they're stepping up in places that are not necessarily, majority Asian Americans, that's good. And I think that we're on the cusp of having a breakthrough here, where we're seeing that kind of next generation of leadership stepping up. And, I'm proud to be part of that.
Great. The 18 members of Congress I mentioned before, it's pretty notable that 16 of them are Democrats and 2 are Republicans. I know that the Asian vote leans towards Democrats, but hasn't always been that way. It certainly isn't that much of a leaning generally today. Why do you think that skew exists in Congress, or rather, maybe it's in who's running for office? I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think part of it kind of gets at this question of where are the population bases, and when you see the kind of different larger hubs of where Asian American communities are, I think you often find them kind of in urban areas or adjacent to urban areas. And, those politics in those areas around the country, whether in a red state or a blue state, are leaning towards Democrats. So there could just be, kind of be sort of an issue there about, where populations are clustered. A lot of the Asian Americans in Congress, a lot of them don't necessarily come from districts like mine that is predominantly, white with a small Asian American population. Many of them represent districts that have larger Asian American populations. So, I think that may account for some of it. I don't know. It's something that I have to think about. It's certainly, I've noticed the same thing you have about just the breakdown of the members and what parties they're in. But I don't think I've necessarily thought further through in terms of what's kind of sparking it. But again, I do think that this question of what gives people the sense of possibility of running. If you look at a number of the Asian American members of Congress, a number of them worked at a local level or state level before coming to federal office. And I think, if you are in a larger Asian American community, it's easier for you to potentially find some of these other positions that can give you a sense of public service and engagement that kind of way. I think my kind of story of kind of starting at the federal level as a diplomat, as a government official, and then coming in, that's actually kind of a rarer story. So I think there are many different paths, but we're starting to see a lot more of them used.
Thanks. So here's another question from the audience. How might someone, an average Jane or Joe who's interested in politics, how do they start to think about playing a role in policy in a non-elected position?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, I love this question because this again is at the heart of what I try to do. I for one always want to try to encourage people to consider a life in public service. That doesn't necessarily have to mean government. But the way my parents always defined service is that, it's not a job, it's a way of life. It's about our responsibility to the people around us. What I would say is it's important to think about what satisfies you. Like what issues or kind of work do you enjoy doing? The way I sort of describe it best is like, what have been the experiences where when when it's at the end of the day after a long day of work, what are the days where you're like, wow, this was a great day? And trying to understand like what satisfies you, because a job, a career in public service, it requires that sustainability and that requires that kind of stamina. We cannot think about public service as mere sacrifice. That is just not going to cut it in this day and age. And so I think what's important is people to understand what drives you. For me, for a long time, it was foreign policy. I loved doing the foreign policy work. I loved being able to do the policy side of it. I was less interested in some of the programming side, like some of the programming sides of the things I did at USAID, which was about, helping set up, these schools or these hospitals. At that time in my life, that was not as fulfilling to me as some of the broader issues about policy. So, that helped shape what departments or agency I worked at. The other thing I'll just say is don't be afraid to engage with folks that are working in public service and asking them questions about their lives. There's no beaten path to this. There's no roadmap to a career in public service. So it's important to really hear from those that have been through this and understand what they bring. in particular, it's important to have mentors. And if you're able to develop that and find that, that I would not be where I'm at now if it wasn't for the mentorship that I received from some very generous people who guided me and gave me some thoughts. So those are just a few things for people to think through.
Andy, what organizations out there that are focused on Asian American engagement, and are they Pan-Asian, or are they, dedicated specific groups? And if there aren't organizations like that, do you think there should be more to bring Asians together as a political unit?
Yeah. So as I said, there are a lot of community groups, and that's been really great to see. I've seen a lot, and as I've traveled around the country, I've engaged with a lot of different community groups. But in terms of like kind of a national structure, there are a couple organizations. There's Asian Americans Advancing Justice. There's a newer one called the Asian American Foundation, called TAFT for short. And there are a few others, and they all do important work in different angles. But like I said, we still need to work on that kind of national cohesion. I do think it's important to be able to have that kind of broader thinking and that broader dialogue. And also, I do have to say, there needs to be a way in which we think about how politics and governance fits in. Some of these different groups, they focus a lot on the community engagement, different legal aspects that they can be provided. But I don't see the kind of maturity and political engagement and advocating and pressing and agenda setting and applying the pressure on Congress or the executive branch. I don't see the kind of level there that I think is necessary, given the challenges that we face. I've seen not as much engagement on the different legislative priorities that I think we should be focused on, and issues like that. And frankly, even on the political and the campaign side, not as much intensity that we can do. There are groups doing it, so no doubt, and those that are doing it, thank you for engaging. But I think they would also be the first to admit that we have a lot of room to grow. So I do feel like this decade is going to be an incredibly important decade, where we can see really where the trajectory of our engagement goes. I mean, our population growth is skyrocketing here in New Jersey. It's blown up in the last 10 years since the last census. Now the question is, is our political capital and engagement keeping up with that kind of velocity? I'm hoping that we can.
Great, thanks, Andy. Look, I think that we're about out of time here, so I'm just going to say a couple words and then hand it over to you to make any closing remarks. First of all, thanks everyone for joining tonight. Thank you, Tom and the Korea Society, for arranging this event. If you like what you hear, please contribute to the Korea Society, and either as a member or just as a donator, as well as I think, to me, the message of tonight more than anything is get involved and be active and participate in this process, which many of you maybe didn't really grow up thinking that was important, or didn't take the initiative to do so. And I think that is crucially important here today and going forward. So Andy, I'll turn it back to you to say any closing remarks for the group.
Yeah, well, thank you, Tony, for the conversation, and thank you, Tom, and to the Korea Society. I look forward to connecting more and finding ways to get engaged, as I'm a big fan. What I'll just say is, look, I kind of hit at this in my last response, but I just want to just kind of point out that this moment right now, I really do believe that we are living through an incredibly important moment in American history. And I do believe that the next 5 years could really shape the next 50 years of this nation on a lot of different fronts. And what I'll even say is I'll go as far as to say we are living through a historic time, whether we like it or not. And I think about my colleague, the late John Lewis, someone who really taught me about what it's like to be a member, and to hear and learn from him about what it means to live through historic times, as he has his whole life. And he really did hit home to me exactly what Tony said, which is that these tough moments and these moments of connection and consequence, that they are shaped by those who step up and those who get engaged. And I really do hope that with everything that we've seen facing our nation, facing the Asian American community, facing the Korean American community, and what we see going forward, the challenges that we face, whether that be climate change or about this renewed great power competition that very much is focused around the Asia Pacific, Indo-Pacific area. I really do hope that we see in this moment a need to get engaged and to find out what it is that each of us can contribute. I'm happy to stay in touch with folks, especially those who are interested in careers in public service or getting engaged. I hand out my email liberally. It's just andy@andykimforcongress.com. If I can be of any help to people who are thinking about getting engaged, or especially young folks that are trying to find ways to have their voices heard, please don't hesitate to reach out. I always want us to be thinking about what it is that we can do. So again, Tony, thanks so much for this conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Andy. All right. Good night, everyone.
Thanks.